Math is hard. Organic chemistry is harder. If you're proficient with both, you may not want to watch this video. Hello, Steve, Canadian Sasquatch, coming at you with Meadology Week 7. Today, we're going to talk about feeding the yeast something other than honey, and when we will do that. Yes, today we are talking about YAN, which is yeast assimilable nitrogen, and SNA, which is staggered nutrient additions. Now, why do we need to feed something other than honey? Well, most things can't live off of sugar alone, and yeast, they're a part of most things. Nitrogen is quite an important part of all life. When you look after your garden or lawn or any plants really, you typically go out there and you fertilize with something that contains nitrogen, among other things. So, yeast being fungi as a plant, they require some nitrogen themselves. Now, I'm not a biologist or a chemist or anything of the like, so I'm going to refrain from chatting anymore about stuff that goes way over my head on all that. And we're just going to get right down into where do we get the nitrogen from and how to figure out how much we need. So where do we get nitrogen for yeast? Well, there are several different places. The most common that people will use is DAP, which stands for diammonium phosphate, which you can get in bags or little jars. So they're and then another one is Fermaid-K, which is just a white powdery stuff, also sold in bags or jugs. Fermaid-K is a complex blend of a yeast nutrient that supplies DAP, free ammonia acids, and various other key nutrients. Something else that you can get is called Fermiad-O. I don't have any of that myself, but it's essentially just dead yeast. So the yeast eat their dead, kind of like zombies. But it's completely organic, does not contain any DAP, and as we'll see later, it has a much lower nitrogen content. So here we have an image of the DAP, or the diammonium phosphate, and the Fermaid-K. The DAP is in the top left-hand corner there, and you can see how it's all crystally-like, kind of like salt crystals, and it's essentially a salt. So that makes sense. And then in the bottom right-hand corner is the Fermaid-K, which is a tan powdery substance. So now that we know what we need to know how much. This is where things get a little mathy. But remember back in week 3 when we were talking about yeast, that one of the things that I wanted you guys to remember was the yeast nutrient requirement of the yeast that you're using. That was one of the 4 different pieces of information from each yeast that would be useful. Well, today is when we need to know the yeast nutrient requirement. And typically the yeast will have them listed as low, medium, and high. That's not very descriptive, but it gets us enough information so we know what we need to do with it. So I'd like to take a minute right now just to state that any of the numbers or websites or anything that I call out and display on the screen, I will have all that information listed down below in the description box. That way if I mess up on the numbers on the screen by not putting them up there, or you don't understand what I'm saying, or any of that, it's down below, all the information you need. And with that, let's talk about the next piece of information that we need. We also need to know the original gravity of the must we made, since the higher the sugar content, the higher the amount of YAN we need. And I'll be saying everything in Brix, but I will show, and down below, put down the gravity as well, just so it's less numbers for me to flub through, because there's going to be a lot of numbers. So what we're going to start off with is 22 Brix and lower we require 225 parts per million yan for the yeast. 22 to 23 Brix is 250. 23 to 24 is 275. 24 to 25 Brix, that's going to be 300 parts per million. And then 25 Brix and higher will be 325 parts per million of the yan that we require. Now that we know how much is required based on the gravity or the Brix, we need to know how much based on the yeast. As I mentioned earlier, the yeast nutrient content is labeled low, medium, or high. And based on that, we use a multiplier. So if we have a low yeast requirement, there'll be actually 0.75 times the amount that I mentioned previously. Medium will be exactly 1 times. High, we multiply it by 1.25 times. This is just based off of the yeast manufacturer's recommendations. So now we know how to calculate how much yan is required in parts per million. So if we have a 1.100 original gravity must using a medium yeast, then we will need 275 parts per million. If we have a 1050 must using a high nutrient yeast, then we will have a 281 parts per million. Awesome, we're done. Any questions? What's that? Speak up, please. Parts per million is useless? What does that mean in gallons or liters? I guess that's kind of important. What's that? How do we calculate how much DAP and Fermaid-K and O we need? Yeah, I guess that's kind of important too. Math is hard. Okay then. We need to know how much everything has so we know how much to calculate out. So, 1 gram of DAP, diammonium phosphate, has 210 parts per million per liter. 1 gram of Fermaid-K has 120 parts per million per liter. And again, 1 gram of Fermiad-O, as I mentioned, it has the least amount, so it has 40 parts per million per liter. Yes, we are working in metric here. Grams per liter is easier numbers to deal with at this point. Once we're done with the mathy bits, then we'll convert it into gallons for those of you who wish to be used in gallons. Now that we know how much nitrogen everything has, why would we not just use one over the other? Well, DAP, the diammonium phosphate, is not organic, and it only has the diammonium phosphates in it. Fermaid-K has both organic and non-organic nitrogen in it, along with the extra bits and bobs like vitamins and minerals that yeast need. But the nitrogen content is lower in it. So this is why we combine it with the DAP to get more nitrogen. And then Fermiad-O, which is purely organic. It's essentially just dead yeast. If you want to go organic, then that's how you do it. You just use the Fermiad-O. So how much of each do you use? Well, Lalvin says to use 30% DAP and 70% Fermaid-K. The other thing to note is that DAP can only be used early on by the yeast, and not so much after the halfway point. By the halfway point, I mean when the yeast had eaten half the sugar. So we want to use DAP early and Fermaid-K early and late. So what I typically do is I take the DAP amount and split it into two. 2/3 for the initial feed-in and 1/3 for the second feed-in. Then I'll take the Fermaid-K and split it into 3, where it'd be half of it for the initial feed-in, 1/4 of it for the middle feed-in or second feed-in, and then the last 1/4 for the final feed. And I might be getting ahead of myself now, as we're now starting to talk about SNA, which is the staggered nutrient additions. This is where you take your nutrients and you split them up. Staggeredly feed the must across different days. Typically, I feed on day 1, which is the day we create the must. Then again at the 1/4 to 1/3 sugar break, and then again at the half sugar break. And again, the sugar breaks that's when that amount of sugars have been eaten. How do you know when the sugar breaks are? You measure them with a hydrometer or a refractometer. Now keep in mind that a refractometer will be incorrect, but there are calculations on how to correct the reading. This is based off of their design to measure sugar and water, not sugar, water, and alcohol. So as soon as there's alcohol present, a refractometer is no longer correct. But again, there are calculations on how to fix that. The easiest way, though, is to go to a website. Down in the description, there will be a couple lists of websites that they all have places where you enter in what you see on the refractometer, and it'll convert it to the corrected gravity. All right, then. Let's get to figuring this all out and how much of each and when to add it and all that. So we're moving into an example here. Let's say we have just made a must that is a 1.100 original gravity, and we'll be using Lavelin's 71B1122, which is a low nutrient yeast. How do I know that? I went to Lavelin's website and it told me, and the links for all this again down below. Since we have a 1.100 gravity, we know we need 275 parts per million yen, right? Based on the information that we've already been over. And since we're using a low nutrient yeast, we multiply that by 0.75. Again, the information that we had from previous. So this gives us a nutrient requirement of 206 parts per million. Now let's use Fermaid-K and DAP. Remembering that we want 70% Fermaid-K and 30% DAP. So with the Fermaid-K, we take the 206 and we times it by 0.7, because that's 70%, and we get 144. Now we need to know how much that is. So we know that Fermaid-K has 120 parts per million per gram per liter. So we take the 144, divide that by 120, and we know we need 1.2 grams per liter of must. Now with the DAP, we take the 206, times it by 0.3, which is 30%. That gives us 63. And then we do 63 divided by the 210 parts per million that we know that DAP provides, and we get 0.3 grams per liter of must. So how many liters are we making? Well, I typically make 3-gallon batches, so that's 11.3 liters. So we need 13.5 grams of Fermaid-K and 3.4 grams of DAP. Great! So now we know how much. Now, how much do we do per SNA drop? Well, I like to take 2/3 of the amount of DAP and half the amount of the Fermaid-K for the initial drop. Then, 1/3 of DAP and 1/4 of the Fermaid-K for the second drop, and then the remaining Fermaid-K for the last drop. This means on drop 1, which is day 1, we have 6.75 grams of Fermaid-K and 2.3 grams of the DAP. And then for our second feeding, which we will do between 1/4 to 1/3 of the sugar break, That's the 3.4 grams of Fermaid-K and 1.1 grams of DAP. And then the last one that we do at the half sugar break, we do the remaining of the Fermaid-K, which is 3.5 grams of the Fermaid-K. So there it is. Simple, easy. So yeah, so it is mathy, and again, the example that I just spewed out will be in the description down below, so you can better visualize between what I said and had on the screen here. So let's go ahead and do one more example. This time we're going to use Fermiad-O. It's a bit different. Typically when I have used it, I will take 10% of the DAP and 10% of the Fermaid-K out of the equation and replace it with Fermiad-O. But you can replace both the DAP and the Fermaid-K with just Fermaid-O if you want to be fully organic, if that's your thing. Not really for me, because you have to use a lot of Fermaid-O and it's pricey, and I'm a bit cheap, and I'm not all that picky about the organic thing when it comes to making the meads. So, but for this example, let's just go 100% Fermaid-O and example it out as that is. Let's see. Let's make a nice light hydromel. So a hydromel is a very low ABV mead. So we're going to start off with a 1060 original gravity. And let's go crazy on the yeast and use a RC212. I wouldn't actually use RC212 for a hydromel. It's a bit of a beast of a yeast. But I want to use a yeast that had a high nutrient requirement for this example. So with a 1060 gravity, we know we need 225 parts per million of yan. And with the yeast that has a high nutrient requirement, we need to multiply that by 1.25, which means we now have a yan requirement of 281. Since we're going to be using 100% Fermaid-O, and its yan is 40 parts per million, we got to go 281 into 40 for a total of 7 grams per liter, which is a lot, like I have mentioned before. So let's do this for a 5-gallon batch. So 7 grams times 19 liters is 133 grams. Great. But when do we add it? How much do we add? Well, personally, I would go 50%, 25%, 25%. This way the yeast has most of the nutrients up front, and as they work their way through and can no longer take up the nutrients, there's less and less in there, so we're not wasting as much. So what does this mean? The initial feeding will be 66.5 grams of the Fermaid-O. Then at the quarter to 1/3 sugar break, we'll be doing 33.25 grams of the Fermaid-O. And then again at the halfway sugar break, again 33.25 grams of the Fermaid-O. There are some people that talk about how Fermaid-O can give off flavors because of the sheer amount that you need to use to make it. I've not had this issue, but then again, I've never used it solely on its own, so I've never used it in the mass quantities that are required. So there you have it, SNA and yan, staggered nutrient additions and yeast assimilable nitrogens. But wait, thinking back to our Joe's Ancient Orange Mead, we didn't add anything to it. It's working out great. Let's actually cut to it now and see how it's doing. And here's the Joe's. It's looking good. The fruit are slowly dropping. Very, very nice. Very nice indeed. It's looking pretty good. I'm very much looking forward to sampling this guy in a couple of weeks when it's done. How's everybody else's doing? Good, good. So back to the fact that we didn't add any yan or do any SNA to it. What gives? For this, we need to think about wine. Proper, plain old grape wine. Why do we want to think about that? Typically, you don't really need to add nutrients when you're making wine with grapes. The grapes themselves have all the nutrients the yeast require to do their thing. Now, what did we add to the Joe's Ancient Orange mead?
Anyone? Anyone?
Did you clue into me saying grape wine and we added raisins, which are just dried grapes? Well, that's where the nutrients came from. This means that you could very much just use raisins for nutrients. This will impart some grape wine flavor to the meads, though if you use a lot of them, but they are a good substitute when you need your mead fix and you don't have any other nutrients to add. Just add a handful per gallon and you'll do okay. And that, my friends, is the end of week 7. And if you stuck it out this far this week, then I applaud you. It was a lot of thinking and mathing, and hopefully I was able to explain things in a manner that's useful. Again, all the information that I've spewed forth will be down below. Be sure to check that out, and hopefully it'll make a bit more sense being able to see it all down there. And if you have any questions at all, feel free to ask us away as always. I still need more questions for week 9. So any questions from today's session or the previous ones are greatly encouraged. Shoot me a PM, leave them in the comments. The more questions, the better. I would also like to invite you to give this video a thumbs up if you haven't already. It really does help, puts a smile on my face. And it makes me know that the video is appreciated and pushes me to continue to think of more to do. Especially after this series is done, since after today there's only 2 left. And if you haven't, I'd also like to invite you to subscribe. That way you can stay tuned for more videos as they come out. And with that, my friends, be sure to have a pint of awesome, because I know I will. Just not right yet. It's a little early. So cheers, everybody.